This is an A-level biology presentation looking at gas exchange in leaves. From GCSE, you should be able to draw and label a plant cell, and you should also be able to draw and label the cross-sectional area of a leaf. Pause the presentation, have a go at those two questions, and when you're ready you can restart the presentation and check your answers. So this is the typical plant cell. Just remember, in the exam they will not necessarily give you a plant cell in that rectangle shape. They are quite prone to give it a little bit more circular and see if you fall for it in terms of saying it's an animal cell. Remember, the only way to tell the difference between plant and animal cells is to look at the organelles inside and identify the different structures. I'm going to highlight some of the ones that you should pick out from A level that you probably haven't covered before. So for example, you've got the Golgi bodies, you've got the endoplasmic reticulum. You go further down, you've got things like the mitochondria, which again you may not be aware of depending on what you've done at GCSE. You'll also have to extend your knowledge on the ones that you already know in terms of their particular functions. If necessary, go back to your notes and materials from the cells unit at the start of the course in year 12 and make sure you're up to speed on the structure and function of all the parts of a cell. In terms of the structure of a leaf, again, you've got each of the different layers in the leaf. You've got the vascular bundle with xylem and phloem. You've got your air spaces, which are just simply gaps between cells. Please, please, please be careful. A stomata is the hole that gas can move in and out of. The guard cells are the cells either side of that stomata hole, and they open or close, and depending on the shape of the guard cells, you will open and close a stomata. What we're going to do in this particular presentation is simply look at the gas exchange in dichotomous plants. We mentioned the stomata. Lots of students talk about stomata and guard cells as if they're the same thing. They really are not. The guard cells are cells that surround a stomata. If a guard cell is in a particular shape, it can close, open, or partially open a stomata. If you look at the pictures, you can see on the left hand side the two guard cells of a particular shape, and they have arranged themselves so there is no stomata open. They're completely shut. That means there is no gas moving in or out of that particular leaf through that particular stomata. In the middle, you can see that the guard cells have a different shape, and because they have a different shape, we now have stomata open. And the thing that determines the shape of the guard cells is the vacuole and how much fluid is inside the guard cells at any one time. Just to help you out, you have been given Fick's law, but try and think of some adaptations of a leaf to maximize the rate of diffusion. Pause the presentation, and when you're ready you can restart and see how you've done. Well, in terms of adaptations, you obviously need to link your answer to Fick's law. So when it says explain the adaptations of a leaf for diffusion, you have to identify the adaptation, but you also have to link it into either surface area, difference in concentration, or length of diffusion pathway. So for example, a large number of stomata will increase the surface area. A large number of air spaces will also increase the surface area, and a large area around the mesophyll cells will increase the surface area. The fact that the leaves are thin means that the length of the diffusion pathway is quite low. What you've got in front of you is an exam style question. Pause the presentation, read through the third bullet points of the actual question, come up with your best answer, and when you're ready you can restart. So in this question, the first bullet point, the name of the organism, is of no relevance whatsoever. The only thing I really need to take from the first point is the fact that it's covered by seawater, because the seawater could affect the rate of photosynthesis and light intensity. The second bullet point, it says that it doesn't have a xylem tissue, so immediately I know it doesn't have a transport system. So when I get to the question about suggest how it's able to survive without the xylem tissue, well, what we've got there is a case of transport systems are needed in larger organisms because the rate of diffusion is so slow that it's not going to provide an adequate supply of substances. In this particular organism, the rate of diffusion is fast enough that it doesn't need a transport system. So I'd have to come up with some specific examples of how that particular organism is adapted in order to maximize the rate of diffusion. Again, the rate of diffusion I know or should have learned Fick's law, so I should be looking for something that will increase the surface area. I should be looking for something that will affect the diffusion pathway, make a diffusion pathway as short as possible, or I should be looking for something that will maximize the concentration gradient. Well, in this particular question, what we can talk about is the short diffusion pathway to the cells because they're thin. We can talk about the fact that it has a surface that is permeable because there's no other way of stuff getting in if it's not permeable. And we can also talk about the fact that there's no structural support needed as lifted up by the water. So the other role of obviously the xylem is to provide structural support, which doesn't apply in this particular organism because it will be underwater. As you've just seen in the exam, they're not going to give you a straightforward question. They're going to give you a question with a little bit of spin on it just to try and confuse you. Don't let them. One of the topics that will come up quite common in the exam is the xerophytic plants. These are plants that live in particular areas where there is a severe limitation to the liquid water available. Now it's important to note that we talk about liquid water because that includes areas with lots of ice or snow, because ice and snow is obviously not in the form that plants can absorb. And one of the most common questions is to name different ways in which these particular types of plants are adapted to their environment. At this point, pause the presentation, try and think of as many ways as you can, and when you're ready you can restart the presentation and check your answers. So there's 5 main ways in which the xerophytic plants are adapted in order to reduce water loss. There's 5 pictures in front of you. Each picture represents one of the main ways that they're adapted. Pause the presentation, try and pick out what the 5 are in case you've missed any from the previous question, and when you're ready you can restart and check your answers. So pause now. Well, the 5 main ways are, first off, we have a thick cuticle. We can also have plants with rolled up leaves. We can also have plants with hairs on the leaf. Sometimes we have the stomata in little pits or in little grooves, indentations. And lastly, we can decrease the surface area to volume ratio. Often a cuticle is referred to as a waterproof barrier, and while it is very much waterproof, there still can be a very small amount of water loss through a cuticle if it is not thick enough. So by thickening up the cuticle as much as possible, you minimize that extra bit of loss. Good example of that is a holly plant, which is why holly leaves are always very shiny. Another adaptation is that we roll up the leaves, and how it works is it basically creates a very humid environment, and because we then have a very low concentration gradient between the two areas, we have much less water loss. Good example of that is marram grass, which is a type of grass you'll find in sand dunes and around the beach. In terms of the hairs on the leaves, what happens is they basically trap the moisture, and it's a slight variation of the rolled up leaf. Again, they reduce the difference in the water potentials inside and outside, and as a result reduce water loss. Heather's a really good example of this. For pits and grooves, it's exactly the same idea, is that we try to reduce the water potential gradient between the area inside the leaf and outside the leaf to try and reduce the evaporation of water. Good example of this is of course pine needles and pine trees. Another thing that plants can do is they can decrease the surface area to volume ratio, often by reducing the surface area. However, they've got to get a balance between making the leaves small enough so that the surface area is reduced to reduce water loss, but you also have to have a large enough surface area to make sure that you are absorbing enough sunlight energy to keep up with the maximum rate of photosynthesis. What you've got is a summary of the information. Remember, if the question says identify or name, you can simply say the name of the adaptation. If the question says explain, you must tell them how that particular adaptation results in less water being lost. And that's the explanation in there. You can of course give examples of them as well, but normally it's either describe or explain in an A-level question. Make sure you take the time to memorize this, because it's not impossible this will be a large number of marks in one question at the end of your paper, so it is well worth taking the time and effort to memorize. And just to finish off, have a go at putting a tweet together for this particular presentation. What would you summarize the whole thing up into? Remember, keep it under 250 characters.